Ang dakila para sa akin ay yung abilidad na iangat ang iyong kaisipan mula sa ordinaryong ginagalawan mo at paabutin ito sa isang mas exalted na antas.
I always tell this to people that dakila is a way of life, and it takes a lot of guts and it takes a lot of courage to stand beyond your principles and to really, live to it.
At may levels yan may levels of sacrifice. Yung simpleng pag-volunteer sa mga advocacy, yung mag-isip tungkol sa society, yung paano pagandahin yung komunidad, parang naging revolutionary act na siya
Kunyari, ang trabaho mo lang sa buong buhay mo ay magpako lang, martilyo ng pako. Pero, pag binuhos mo ang iyong buong kaluluwa, ang iyong buong kaisipan, ang iyong buong pagkatao doon sa isang pako ngayon, nagiging dasal siya Sa akin, ang dakila.
That's what dakila is all about. Just doing what's needed to be done in your own way, no matter how small.
If we want to voice out to the evils of society alone, it seems impossible. Parang gusto mo nang kakampi to have a better future.
Nagagawa natin mga dapat gawin para sa bayan, para sa kapwa Pilipino, pero hindi natin binibitawan na magiging masaya. So, okay na ako dito sa dakila.
Never again? We must unite and say, this is a false statement. We cannot dwell on the past if we want a bright future. We must embrace this destiny. Our heroes rise, our heroes fall. What we must remember is that the people of the Philippines are nothing without strong leaders who are the true heroes. We must also celebrate those grand edifices, riches, and legacies. History should not only commemorate the faults and the tragedies, but also learn from only what is considered good. We must not be limited by people power and human rights. We must work hard and embrace how to achieve true progress and change.
How to achieve true progress and change? We must work hard and embrace people power and human rights. We must not be limited by only what is considered good, but also learn from the faults and the tragedies. History should not only commemorate grand edifices, riches, and legacies. We must also celebrate those who are the true heroes. Strong leaders are nothing without the people of the Philippines. What we must remember is that our heroes fall, our heroes rise. We must embrace this destiny. We cannot dwell on the past if we want a bright future. This is a false statement. We must unite and say, never again.
Papatayin ba natin yan? May buhay din yan. Pero ang matigas ng ulo, patayin talaga.
In my country, there's 3 million dragons. I'd be happy to slaughter them to finish the problem.
ignore.
The Philippine leader has faced criticism for launching a drug war in his country.
It's scary if these people are brought to power again.
Every day you cover these scenes, you began to fear for your life.
My campaign against drugs will not stop. Nobody can stop me.
I want to mother not only the Philippines but the world.
Imelda Marcos gotten away with murder.
The danger is that we might lose democracy because we're willing to give it up.
Our country and the Filipino people have been victimized by its politicians since time immemorial. Pero ang ikinalulungkot ko, yung hindi na tayo natuto.
Bakit mo ginagawa to?
Dahil martial law.
Hindi ako takot sa mga kriminal. Talagang hindi ko sila hihigilan.
Sequence 14, shot 1, take 1.
Ayan. Welcome everyone to our forum this afternoon. Today is our second of 4 forums of the festival's viewpoint section. And today we'll be trying our best to demystify the demagogues and dictators of our society. I'm Alice Vico. I'm from Vista, your host for this afternoon. And we'd like to get to know all of you as well, joining us in the Zoom webinar and watching us on Facebook. So do introduce yourselves in the chat box where you're from and what org you're part of. The Activista International Human Rights Festival is an annual event that celebrates rights, freedoms, and dignity held on the Martial Law Anniversary Commemoration Week in the Philippines. Today marks 48 years since Proclamation 1081 was signed, putting our nation under martial law, taking effect 2 days after on September 23, 1972. We dedicate this whole afternoon in remembrance of this dark period in our nation's past that continues to shadow over us. Together, we commemorate the heroes who fought and continue to struggle with us today against the terrors that remain in power over and how somehow seeping kahit within us until today. This whole week, we bring attention to stories of human struggles through films, exhibits, performances, forums, and events, a whole experience we want to take you into to empower our voices and our imagination, into starting important conversations on issues brewing inside and outside of ourselves, to collectively develop critical thought and new visions in how we struggle towards building a just society and that fully enables human rights and democracy. So before we begin this forum, let me start with a few housekeeping guidelines. For those joining us in the webinar room, please send in your questions to the Q&A box. That's so it will allow us to see your questions quickly and they don't get lost in the comments and insight. And it also allows us to either answer them live or type in our answers directly. Also, find as many ways as you can to express yourself throughout the forum. We've opened up a Mentimeter page for you, so you can open that on the side as the forum flows all afternoon. Just go to menti.com and key in the key code 8633053. Again, well, parang bingo, 8633053. We'll send it in the chat box as well. And then we also encourage every one of you to speak out your truth on any kind of platform that you have a hold on, whether it's social media or even dialogue with friends and family. But if you go online, we'd love it if you use the hashtags for our social media rally din today. Hashtag walang pipikit, hashtag manatiling mulat, hashtag never forget, hashtag never again to martial law, hashtag uphold human rights, and of course, hashtag AVIHRF 2020. And you can tag at @Dakila_PH and at Activista. We'll also put that in the chat box para madaling maalala at madaling ma-copy-paste into your tweets. Again, this whole chat box belongs to every single one of you. So go ahead and leave comments, insights, and shout-outs. Claim that space. The forum is also live streamed on several Facebook pages, so you can leave your comments in those Facebook streams then. Big thanks to those who collaborated with us. So our partners who will be cross-posting this afternoon are Bantayog ng Mga Bayani, hashtag WeTheFuturePH, University of St. La Salle Political Society, Kausap, USLS, UP Cebu Student Council, UP Manila Organization of Area Studies Majors, UP Cinema Arts Society, Loyola Film Circle, sanggunian ng mga mag-aaral ng mga paaralang Loyola ng Ateneo de Manila or Ateneo Sanggu, Ateneo Human Rights Center, Buklod Sining, Malabon Youth Council, Laban PUP, Viva Voce COC of PUP also, DZMC Young Communicators Guild of PUP, Center for Youth Advocacy and Networking, Student Council Alliance of the Philippines, I Defend, Philippine Alliance of Human Rights Advocates or PARA, the Facebook page of Chel Diokno, the Facebook page of Rodolfo Sabaiton Jr., Art Rally Manila, Lapis, Seesaw Channel, St. Paul Seminary, Cinema Centenario, Word of the Lord, 𝐃𝐤𝐦𝐿, Rank Magazine, Team Mag, National Union of Journalists of the Philippines, Alter Media, Assortage, Media Commoner, and lastly, Verifiles. So that's a lot of Facebook pages that you can find us on. So hopefully you get a chance to watch this and you can turn back to those pages to watch the stream again if ever you're unavailable at this time. So anyways, that's it from me. I'll pass on the forum so we can formally begin. So our moderator for this afternoon is a human rights advocate, strategist, artist, and educator with over a decade of experience in advocacy communications, social impact, campaigning, and creative activism. She recently graduated from the London School of Economics and Political Science with a Master of Science in Social and Public Communication after completing the program on a Shivling Scholarship. Everyone, let's welcome Ms. Micheline Rama, co-founder of Dakila, Philippine Collective for Modern Heroism. Take it away, Mitch.
Thanks, Ali. Mayong hapon sa inyong tanan. Welcome to our forum this afternoon. Please do keep your comments going. We really welcome this discourse. And to start off this forum, we begin by revisiting our nation's past and the pains brought about by martial law. To take us there, we welcome a graduate of the Bachelor of Science in Architecture in 1976 from the University of San Carlos in Cebu City. She passed the board examination in 1977, but instead of practicing the building of physical infrastructure, she went into social infrastructure building instead by working with local communities and local government units. These milestones were cruelly interrupted when her freedom was taken away by the Marcos dictatorship in 1974 and then again in November 1977. She did manage to finish her master's in development management at the Asian Institute of Management, or AIM, in 1991, and since has become a development consultant in different foreign-assisted projects such as livelihood, environment protection, protected area management, local governance, and community participation, responsible parenthood, and TV, continuing her social infrastructure advocacy. She is now retired and is a member of the Board of Trustees of the following foundations: the Bantayog ng Mga Bayani Foundation, the Child Rights Coalition Asia, and the Jose W. Diokno Foundation. Everyone, please give your virtual warm round of applause to Ms. Esther Iting Isberto.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to this forum. Our active Vista host, thank you so much. Let me start off with a story of a grade 2 pupil, 8 years old. We went to their school. This is a Montessori school. And in the question session, I asked them, do they know Marcos? And the response of the students were, and these were grade 3s to grade 6 students, yes, we do know Marcos. So I asked them, so what do you know about Marcos? And they said, he is a bad president. He was not good for our country. I was really surprised. Why? Because in most schools that we have gone to, whenever we would ask that question, and these are high school students or college students, when we would ask that question, they would say, yes, they know Marcos, and he's the best president ever that the country had. So my next question to my young audience was, so when did Marcos become president of the country? And here was this young little boy seated on the floor, raising his hands avidly, asking to be called. And so I called him up. Yes, when did Marcos become the president of the country? And this was his answer. He said Marcos became president in 1965. Then he ran for re-election in 1969. And in 1972, he declared martial law because he did not want to step down from power. In 3 sentences, this young grade 2 student and 8 years old summarized what Marcos' intention was in declaring martial law. It was not about student demonstrations or against the communist rebels or the Muslim rebellion. It was simply a grab of power from the center, from Marcos himself, who wanted to stay in power until he dies and his family will take over, like Imelda Marcos or his children. So that was the whole story of why he declared martial law in September 21, 1972. My reason for joining the underground were 3 reasons. And this is not only my reason. This was the reason of most of the young people then. Some started as early as 14 years old. I came in late. I started at 19. And what were the reasons? 1, to defend the freedom of the country. 2, to resist the Marcos dictatorship. And 3, because we love our country. I was detained in Cebu in 1974 for 3 months. I was a student then, taking up BS Architecture at San Carlos University. My second detention was in 1977, and I was placed in the Bicutan Rehabilitation Center at the criminal compound. I and 2 others, my husband, were kept in complete isolation for 3 months in the criminal building. So those 3 months really brought things to your mind, and you asked yourself, was this the right move? Was this correct? What we did? And at the end of the day, after thinking about it, I always came up with the answer that, yes, we were correct, and the government was wrong. Many of my generation were imprisoned. They were tortured. They were massacred, killed, missing until today. I would like to share with you some of the books, which I hope that you can read too, because these are very interesting stories. The first book is about 𝐃𝐞𝐦𝐲𝐬𝐭𝐢𝐼𝐻. He was a Kalinga chieftain who worked against the Chico River Dam, because if the dam continued, their whole village would have been submerged. So they said no to that Marcos project. And because of that, he, leading their tribe, the military went to his village and went to his house and killed him. The second book, Eugene. This is about Edgar Hopson. He graduated valedictorian from high school, graduated cum laude from Ateneo, management engineering, was detained and escaped detention, went underground. He was captured again and was killed by the military in Davao City. The third book, Subversive Lives. This is a story of the lives of the Kimpo brothers and sisters, of their lives in the underground, and how they fought for freedom for the country. The last book is by Reysa Robles. This is Never Again, and it talks about the martial law years. It would be good if you students could get copies of these books, so that you will hear the stories of young men and women of my generation who gave up so much, not only their own freedom, but they had to face imprisonment, tortured, killed, some massacred, and missing up to today. Marcos stayed in power for 21 years, 7 years as president of the country, and 14 years as its dictator. So that's all in all 21 years. After Marcos was booted or ousted from Malacanang, what lessons do we need to learn? And one of the basic lessons, which I think is so important, is that our students, our young people, have to know exactly what happened during the Marcos years. Because of social media now, and because of a lot of false data on what the Marcoses were, many young people think that his reign as a dictator was blessing to the country. It definitely was not. And many of us can attest to that until now. Now, after him, 𝐃𝐤𝐿 Aquino's government was plagued with 6 to 7 coup d'etats by the military. So if she wanted to teach the lessons of martial law, I think it would be very difficult for her. Next came Fidel Ramos. I don't think he could teach martial law, the lessons of martial law too, because first of all, he was the head of the Philippine Constabulary, which was the #1 group that tortured a lot of detainees. And when he took office as president, he abrogated or changed the name of the Philippine Constabulary, and this is now the police. Then we have Erap Estrada, who is very much pro-Marcos. After Erap, we have Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, who was at the same time plagued with corruption and the Garci tape. Then we have Noynoy Aquino. He was the son of Corazon and Ninoy Aquino, who was assassinated. This would have been the best time to teach from kindergarten, elementary, high school to college. What lessons do we need to learn of those dark years? But this was also not done. Now, if this was done, I guess Bongbong Marcos would not have nearly won the vice presidency. We are glad that Lenny was able to win that position, not Bongbong Marcos. We have a lost generation. Many of my generation, young men and women, I said, have given up their lives. A few of us are still alive until today, but we are also in our senior years. No? And what is the kind of country that we wanted? We wanted a progressive country where people are treated equally. We wanted a government that would serve its people and not plunder its money. A government that would respect human rights. It was clear in our minds that we are all doing this for the love of our country. Perhaps if these young women and men were alive today, they would have made a great difference in governing this country. We need to teach the lessons of those dark years. Our students have to be educated. Without that, the recurrence or those dark years can definitely come back. As I guess many of you know, with the anti-terror bill now in place and with the present government, those years are definitely coming back. We have to love our country. Nobody else will. Tayo lang, mga Pilipino. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Iting Isberto. As a Cebuana myself, I appreciate your perspective and sharing your story here. And we don't often hear stories from martial law from outside of Metro Manila, and we really appreciate that as well. And speaking of the Visayas and where we're from, we have viewers joining us today watching from the province, which experienced the famine during the Marcos. Guys, look it up. We're participants from Negros Occidental. Thank you for sharing your perspectives and your stories. And you may continue to do so in our chat boxes, in our comment sections, and also on our Mentimeter tool. You can log in to menti.com and type in the code 8633053. That's 8633053. And we'll be putting that into the chat boxes as well. Now, we've seen a perspective from the past, our next topic now delves into what has become of our democracy today and how it got into its current state, and if we can do something about it. We have with us the founding dean of the De La Salle University College of Law and chair of the Free Legal Assistance Group, or FLAG. He has been a practicing lawyer for 30 years and has gained prominence as a human rights lawyer and litigator. The LSU College of Law, which opened in 2010, is the first law school in the Philippines to highlight human rights and legal aid as a main part of its educational program, while the Free Legal Assistance Group is the oldest organization of human rights lawyers in the Philippines, known for handling cases involving civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. Though already well known in legal and human rights circles, this man has gained wider public prominence when he ran on a platform of justice and judicial reform during the 2019 senatorial elections, where he emerged as one of the leading opposition senatorial candidates and consistently topped nearly all pre-election polls and surveys in schools and universities. I'm sure the members of our chat groups here in Zoom can attest to that. And as the younger generation's woke lolo, he continues to engage with his children by serving as a speaker for various events for numerous schools and organizations all over the country, with speaking engagements serving as a venue for continuing his advocacy for justice, human rights, and empowering the youth. We're honored to have him join us today. Please welcome Attorney Jose Manuel Chel Diokno.
Thank you, Mitch, at magandang araw sa ating lahat. Itong araw na ito ay isang makasaysayang araw at maigi na rin at pag-usapan natin yung mga kwento ng martial law. Ngayong hapon na ito, meron akong kakaibang kwento sa inyo. I think you have heard stories about how human rights were violated during martial law, stories about how the people's money was plundered by the Marcoses, and so many other things about how terrible the dictatorship was to our people. But there is one story that hasn't really been told. And it's a story about how the Marcoses actually killed not just our freedoms, but how they killed our justice system. And I want to spend a little time talking about that because it's something that every one of us, especially you young people, deserve to know. I prepared just a few slides, which I'd like to share with you now. There's a lot that's been said about the Marcos dictatorship, but little has been really talked about how it destroyed our justice system and poisoned the practice of law. And I think it's about time we expose the truth about this. I think it's about time that people know the kind of effect that they had on our legal system. Marami sa atin nagrereklamo kung bakit ganito ang hustisya sa Pilipinas ngayon. Pero kung tutuusin, kung alam nyo lang yung nangyari noon, mas madali nyong maintindihan kung bakit sobrang bagal, sobrang bulok ang sistema ng hustisya na umiiral sa Pilipinas ngayon. It all started a week after Marcos declared martial law. He issued Letter of Instruction number 11, which required every member of the national government to submit a letter of resignation, including judges. So all the more than 1,000 judges in the country had to submit resignation letters to the president, which he could accept at any time. In other words, hawak-hawak lang niya yung mga resignation letter na yan. Pag hindi kanya magustuhan, kung magkaroon kayo ng desisyon na hindi sang-ayon sa kanyang rehimen, he would simply accept your resignation. And in that one stroke, he destroyed the independence of the judiciary. Pero hindi siya nakontento doon. 4 months later, January of 1973, he changed the Constitution. And in the 1973 Constitution, meron siyang isiningit doon sa transitory provisions. Anong inilagay niya? Sabi niya, every member of all the courts in the Philippines, lahat ng judge, lahat ng justice, you can continue in your position until you reach the age of mandatory retirement, which is 70 years old, unless I decree otherwise. Ano ngayon ang naging epekto ng 1973 Constitution na yan? Judicial capture. From 1972 until 1986, Marcos owned every single judge and justice in the country because he could remove them at any time. Ibig sabihin, ang hustisya nung panahon ni Marcos, hindi na hustisya na kung ano ang tama, kundi ang hustisya na kung ano ang gusto ni Marcos. And that is what happened to justice in our country. Kahit sinong judge, pati justice ng Supreme Court, pag hindi niya nagustuhan, he would simply, by the stroke of a pen, remove them from office. And in fact, he did exercise that power repeatedly during martial law. Pero isipin nyo, kung na-capture niya yung judiciary natin, ano kaya ang naging epekto sa mga abogado? Imagine if you're a lawyer at that time, of course, you want to earn money, you want to attract the biggest clients, and you realize that the judges that you are appearing before owe their position to Marcos. Then you begin to put two and two together. Kung gusto ko makakuha ng malalaking kliyente, kailangan dikit din ako sa Malacanang. Para ma-attract ko sila, sasabihin ko sa mga kliyente ko, dito kayo sa amin. Akong bahala sa inyo. Kung akong abogado ninyo, siguradong panalo tayo kahit hanggang Supreme Court pa yan. Imagine what that did to the legal profession, where a lot of us, not everyone, but so many in the profession became glorified fixers. Good at legal technicalities, yung naririnig nyo ngayon, the law is the law. Nako, nung panahon ni Marcos, ganyan din yan. And also good at intimidating judges. Kasi kung kilala ka ng judge na dikit sa Malacanang, matakot kang magdesisyon laban sa akin, agad-agad kitang i-report sa Malacanang. And that was even recognized in a decision of the Supreme Court in 1986, where a ponente said, in the past few years, the judiciary was under heavy attack by an extremely powerful executive. During this state of judicial siege, lawyers, both in and outside the judiciary, perceptively surrendered to the animus of technicality. In the end, morality was overwhelmed by technicality, so that the latter emerged ugly and naked in its true manifestation. But think about it, yung mga fixer na abogado na yan, they set up networks during the Marcos time. Networks among judges, among law enforcers, among different government agencies, jail officials. Unfortunately, those networks were never dismantled. They outlasted the Marcos dictatorship and still operate today. That is the legacy that the Marcoses have left us. That is the legacy that no attempt at historical revisionism can change. Kaya maraming nagtataka, paano ba? Bakit nakalusot ang mga Marcos? That is one of the main reasons kung bakit walang pananagutan ang pamilya. That is also why our justice system is really in such a terrible state today. Yan po ang dahilan kung bakit hindi patas ang hustisya sa Pilipinas. Kung bakit doble kara siya. Na pag ikaw ay malaking tao, siguro makakatikim ka ng hustisya, pero kung pangkaraniwang mamamayan ka lang, asa ka pa na makakakukuha ka ng hustisya sa mga korte. But what can we do about it? I truly believe this is not a hopeless situation. You know what is making it hopeless? Is the succession of administrations that continue to turn a blind eye to the justice system in our country. The succession of administrations, including this one, that refuse to understand and to accept and recognize that they need to do something about our justice system. Kasi alam nyo, ang paniwala ko, ang pinakamalaking sagabal sa pag-asenso natin bilang isang bansa ay ang bulok na sistema ng hustisya na yan. Kaya laganap ang corruption sa atin. Kaya hindi natin matapos-tapos yung mga issue ng mga sindikatong kriminal, mga smuggling, mga droga, iba't ibang mga criminal organization dahil nga they take advantage of the weaknesses of the justice system. And I will be the first to tell you that our justice system is really not working the way it should. We have an extremely low conviction rate. We have no monitoring system to ensure that those who are convicted actually go to jail. Sobrang bagal ang paglilitis ng kaso. Pwedeng umabot ng 20 taon bago matapos yung kasong kriminal. And there's a lot of issues about corruption and lack of transparency in the courts. So what can we do about it? Sa akin, there's a lot that we can do about it. Number one, we need to cleanse the judiciary. Dapat may masampulan dyan, matuto ang lahat ng judge na kailangan maayos, diretso, at walang lagayan ang sistema. Second, we need to dismantle those networks of glorified fixers who have really poisoned our legal profession. Number three, we need to fill the vacancies among judges and prosecutors with honest, competent, and dedicated lawyers. Fourth, I think we should require all justices to publish their SALN and to submit to lifestyle checks. And fifth, we need to establish a truly civilian police force trained in gathering evidence, punishing the guilty, and protecting the innocent. Is this a hopeless task? I don't think so. I think it is very doable. Ang kailangan lang ay maiengganyo natin ng ating pamahalaan na gawin itong prioridad ng ating Kongreso at ng buong executive department. Because with the political will, we can change this. In less than one generation, I believe that we can develop a justice system that is truly capable of rendering justice to our people. Kasi kung iisipin natin yung ating kasaysayan, mula pa ng panahon nila Rizal, nila Mabini, ano ba talaga yung hinahanap natin? Yung hinahanap natin, justisya. Yung hinahanap natin, kalayaan. Yung hinahanap natin ay yung dignidad ng bawat Pilipino. And that is what justice is all about. I hope that my short talk this afternoon has been enlightening because it's about time that we talk about and we demand justice for our people. Magandang hapon po at maraming salamat.
Maraming salamat, Attorney Chel. Salamat din sa insights nyo. Tama, no? Hanggang ngayon, ramdam talaga natin yung epekto ng martial law, hindi lang sa justice system natin, kundi pati sa mga experience ng panelists natin, pati na sa audience na nanonood ngayon. May mga kwento na sinamit yung ating mga audiences ngayon tungkol sa mga kakilala nila o kung sila man ay naging biktima ng martial law. And I think isa siyang testamento na hanggang ngayon nandito pa rin tayo at kinukwento pa rin natin to at pinaglalaban pa rin natin. So ibabasahin ko lang yung ibang experiences dito. Don't worry for those who are asking questions. We'll have a Q&A after all of our panelists. For now, let's jump into your submissions on Mentimeter. Meron tayong kwento dito na my uncle was held in prison because he rebelled. He also jumped into the river to escape soldiers. Some people shared that their lola and their mom's classmates were among those who were detained. Another said that his or her great-grandfather's first telco had to be handed over to Marcos. People have their brothers, parents, sisters. Others mentioned the great figures of that time, Susan Quimpo, Ninoy Aquino, Lorena Barrios, Edgar Hobson. And another just says simply, yung biktima ng martial law ay ang Pilipinas. So I think dyan pa lang kita natin na ramdam pa rin natin yung epekto ng martial law at baka kailangan din natin balikan para pag-isipan kung ano yung pwede natin gawin ngayon at bukas at hanggang kailan pa para hindi umulit ang kasaysayan. Now, we follow on our narratives that we have from the previous speakers to something that where we look into narratives paved by past and present administrations. No? Discussing this with us is an outstanding contemporary writer, human rights activist, and feminist. She's the author of 6 books. Her short story collections include Bitter Country and Monsoon Country. Her two novels are State of War and Twice Blessed, which earned the 1993 American Book Award for Excellence in Literature. She's a two-time award recipient of the New York Foundation for the Arts Fellowship and is a frequent contributor to Miss Magazine, The Nation, The Village Voice, Q, and other US and European periodicals. She was a political prisoner under the Marcos regime in the Philippines, and she was forced into exile when threatened with a second arrest. She's currently based in New York and is active in the organization which she co-founded called Affirm. Everyone, please welcome Ms. Ninotchka Rosca.
Hi. Good morning. It's kind of chilly in New York City at the moment, so bear with me. I had to put on a hat and a vest, and I tried to put on the heater, but it blew the fuse. So I have prepared a few slides for my presentation. I have taken a different tack in approaching this subject. I decided to more or less sum up what we have learned and what we have observed from the people who impose dictatorships on the country and on the people. I might mess this up, but don't worry. Can I share my screen? Oh. Micheline, I need you
Yes,
to move.
Ninotchka. Your share screen is enabled. Let me.
Yes. Why is it sharing my? Oh. Okay, here. Can you see it? Can you see this?
I can't see your screen just yet. Did you click the share screen?
Yes.
Tech team?
Now your screen is the one that's coming up.
Hi, Ms. Ninotchka. Kumusta po? Do you see a sign that says, that shows you different screens to share when you press screen share?
I see only Micheline's screen.
Oh. Okay, yes, we can take over and present it for you.
Okay, thank you. The title of my presentation is Past and Future Tense. Let us start with a statement that we all know, but we seldom articulate. The dictator rides the winds of our hopes and dreams. He comes as a savior or a knight in shining armor. He is seductive. This is the first element of a dictatorship. The dictator must be attuned to what you think you need, what you think should be done, what you think you are due. And he gives you the expectation that you will have all of that. The second statement is the dictator comes in the guise of our own archetypes. Whether imaginary or historical, the dictator dresses himself as an avatar of the villains and the heroes of our collective unconscious. We have to study this. Third, the dictator is a solipsist, extremely egocentric. His concerns are determined by his wants and his desires. He is the center of the universe. Those who prop up that universe are the only people of value to him. There is no boundary between him and the government. There is no boundary between him and the nation. The nation is to him an abstraction, a manifestation of his being and his power. He is the nation, and everything in the nation belongs to him. Next, the director sees the people and the nation as stage props to his destiny. He lacks empathy. Everyone outside of his cabal is but part of the landscape. Then the dictator believes that he is entitled to everything, and everything is due him. That means the public treasury, for a start, the powers of the legislative and the judiciary, the might of the police and the military, and endless adulation from the people. He takes the slightest criticism with great umbrage. And lastly, the dictator is the ultimate gaslighter and liar. We know where the term gaslight came from. It's from a movie by Hitchcock, in which a man convinces a woman that she was not about to be murdered. In sum, we have 6 characteristics. The dictator is a usurper of dreams and hopes of a nation. He is a fake avatar of a culture's heroic and heroism. He is a solipsist who cannot see the world outside himself. He doesn't even believe there is a world outside himself. He is empathy devoid. He is corrupt. He is a gaslighter and a liar. These traits we know from a study of Ferdinand E. Marcos, and we know this also from a study of all the dictators and tyrants from the time of Sumer, where Western civilization started. I will speak about that more actively. Winter Tale series of Affirm for the International Committee. I hope you can all join us in that series of lectures. We put it together to break some of the parochialism of political boxes. In any case, I would add a 7th one. A dictator is rigid and cannot change. Neither can his cabal. We make the mistake very often of forgiving. We should not do that. As we have seen in the last years, the people around the dictator cannot change and will not change. 34 years after the overthrow of Ferdinand Marcos, we are once again grappling with ominous signs of someone wanting to perpetuate himself and his cabal in power. And we are once again reminding the nation of that first instance of a dictatorship within our living memory. And listen to that, living memory. Within our living memory, we are in this problem again. We should perhaps start asking the question, which we should have asked way back in 1986. And this is the question. Next slide, please. How did he manage to stay in power for so long? As 1986 showed, they be few and we be many. Not all the combined forces of the military and the constabulary and the police could stop the overthrow of Marcos once we, the millions, decided that he should go. So why did it take so long to reach that realization? This is a question we should understand, and we should look for the answer too. Take the first character of a dictator, a usurper of our dreams and our hopes. The problems of the Philippines are centuries old. The gross class inequality, gross exploitation, the massive accumulation of wealth for a few, and recently, even while sections of the population are scrounging for food in garbage dumps. The reduction of every relationship we have to the cash nexus, whether that be a relationship with the land, with the mountains, with the seas, and between and among ourselves. Mr. Marcos's cabal deforested Cagayan, Samar, and most of the areas of the Philippines. The cabal took over public lands like the Davao Penal Colony. We have that in the next slide. And also the public land where the Harrison Plaza used to stand. It is closed now, and I don't know if they have replaced it with a planned condominium. Mrs. Marcos ruined the drainage system of the city of Manila with her beautification projects and foisted the worst looking train system ever on the city of Manila. Mining destroyed mountains, and if the Cordillera people had not resisted, the Chico River would have been dammed, and all the ancestral lands of the indigenous peoples would have been drowned. Mr. Marcos cabal allowed the sex trade, the growth of the sex trade in the areas of Clark Air Base and Subic Naval Base. He also started the export of Filipino labor to overseas countries. Mrs. Marcos even funded her elitist film festival, art film festivals, with money earned from showing pornographic films to the Filipino people. All this, and yet he remained in power for 22 years. Even as he looted the nation and sank the country into massive, massive debt. He came in the guise of our archetypal heroes. Bernardo Carpio, Lamang, Lapu-Lapu, and Res Bonifacio. These figures are deep in our collective unconscious, and in spite of hundreds of years of oppression, the poor and the very poor among us yearn for a materialization of our heroes. They're coming into flesh, and we are constantly looking for a savior. From the time of the Sumerian civilization, the power has always claimed a connection to divine power. The absolute monarch is invariably a descendant of some god or goddess or some elemental or muse. Hence, Mr. Marcos's first book was Iginuhit ng Tadhana. By fate decreed. An assertion of a destiny forged outside the power of the people. There is a logic to all of this grandiose myth-making. It is to disempower the people and to make them believe that the dictator was somebody anointed by the gods. We are, as you know, a people prone to cults, which are exploitative of our inherited sense of the divine, which used to be embodied in the Babaylan. This transmogrification from the divine that walks among us and is attuned to our daily problems into an untouchable, invulnerable superpower has been the bane of our culture. Look at Pastor Quiboloy. The right of punishment, which used to be conferred by a divine power, has now been transferred into a being called the Punisher. So this is a fake avatar of our culture's heroic elements. Mr. Marcos styled himself a WW2 hero. I think that's slide 16. With his 27 medals of bravery and his guerrilla unit called Maharlika. Nobody knows where he got his 27 medals. And Maharlika in India and Bangladesh means big penis. In his case, we might say the big prick. What we know is that his father, Mariano Marcos, who was never a don, by the way, was executed by Filipino guerrillas. And two, Mr. Marcos's claims for war reparations and back pay from the United States was rejected as fraudulent. Now we come to our current wannabe, Mr. Duterte, who has chosen to underscore his affinity for and with Lapu-Lapu, a warrior as opposed to Jose Rizal, who was an intellectual, or to Andres Bonifacio, a Tagalog, who was killed by his own men, by his own comrades. Lapu-Lapu was a defender of an island, a white man killer. Both Rizal and Bonifacio came from the Tagalog lands, from whence the concept of a nation emerge. Hence the contrast between regional and national affiliation, between regional and national identities. This has been a long-standing division. This, our inability to see beyond one's immediate boundaries. It has been said that Filipinos are group-oriented, but antisocial, meaning it is difficult for many of us to look beyond the family, the peer group, the clan, our ethno-linguistic affiliation, our province, our provincial identities. The dictator exacerbates all of these divisions and uses them to his advantage. As we saw in 2016 with Mr. Duterte screaming about Manila imperialism, never mind the 70% of the taxes gathered in Manila goes to support of projects in the provinces. However, we should note that nobody has destroyed Manila. Both Mr. Marcos and Mr. Duterte destroyed the cities in Mindanao. Mr. Marcos burned down Jolo, napalmed it, and Mr. Duterte destroyed Marawi, which has not been rebuilt. A solipsist who cannot see the world outside himself and who is therefore devoid of empathy. These two go together. He who thinks that the sun revolves around him cannot see other planets, nor comets, nor asteroids. He therefore has no idea how rare life is in the universe, and therefore has little compunction about taking life, ending life. Mr. Marcos started with the little case of Nalundasan, Norberto Nalundasan. I think that's yes, Nalundasan. And that case forms a part of his mythology. Mr. Duterte has admitted to killing at least 3 men and shooting a classmate who fortunately did not die. The gun, the ability to kill, is part of the narrative of a dictator. What we do not see is that these cases were not mano a mano. Instead, unarmed men in defenseless situations were killed. Nalundasan was shot by a sniper. Mr. Duterte has characterized his kills as captured criminals. So, and then the next point, a dictator is corrupt in thought, word, and deed. I do not have to elucidate on this, as the dictator considers everything in the nation as justly his. He can therefore access the national and public treasury as his own wallet. The ego has grown so huge that boundaries between private uses and public wealth have been erased. This looting of the public treasury goes on to this day, from the Philippine health scandal to the absurdity of spending 50 million pesos for a caldero. One can't even make paksiw in that caldero. There is, however, another aspect to this corruption, which enhances the dictator's image, and that is sexism and misogyny. Mr. Marcos, while alive, was trailed by tales of sexual relationships with various women quietly in whispers, except for Dovidim, who became a major scandal. Mr. Duterte brags of his sexual peccadillos, his 2 wives, though he has kept mum by and large on other women rumored to be or to have been his mistress. We should remember what Susan Brown Miller said about using the penis as weapon, the penis as a metaphor of weapon. Mr. Duterte tries hard to subjugate with his penis and has foisted a naked misogyny and sexism on women, on gays, on trans women, on just about everybody who could be sexualized. A dictator is a gaslighter and a liar. From the claimed authorship of myriads of books to his fantasies of being a war hero, Mr. Marcos created the model for a Philippine dictator. He used the government's broadcast system to propagate his lies. I recall one report about Imelda inaugurating a housing project for the poor, the urban poor. It was just a facade of houses. That was all, a Potemkin show. Of course, very much like the white picket fences used to hide the slums of Manila from the eyes of visiting celebrities. Well, today we have a beach, a white beach of dolomite. And now I will leave you with this image, which I think is a very apt metaphor for a dictator. The maninilong. The maninilong. This is a creature who is a compound of all our terrors, something that lies deep in our subconscious, a being of tales and fables. The maninilong feasts on corpses, draws his sustenance from dead flesh, gathers his powers from the ingestion of the tissues of dead people. I will ask you now, if the maninilong's power comes from a feeding on the dead, when do you think will he stop? Will he stop? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ninotchka. That was definitely something that gave us food for thought, hopefully not from the dead. And for those who I'm sure your interest and your curiosity has been piqued, please do keep your comments coming, either in our question and answer box here on Zoom or in the comment sections on your Facebook Live. We'll be revisiting them in our Q&A later on. And I hope you guys were taking notes now of the 7 characteristics we should keep an eye out for as we are nearing our next cycle of our election season. So please do share what you've learned today, and maybe share this not just with our group, but with those outside of our group. One person who's watching now shares that her aunt is a Marcos loyalist and apologist, and they're here to learn or be able to teach her and persuade her to change her views on the dictator, or maninilong as it were. So we might be able to give some insights there later on. Some people share that they know a lot of musicians and activists na bigla na lang daw nawala after mag-perform sa rally. Yes, please do share these stories here. We also have our Mentimeter. You'll see it in a pinned comment if you're on Facebook, and in our chat stream here on Zoom if you'd like to add your insights here. And another insight from our stream on Facebook, someone shared that since martial law years until now, the men in uniform are the biggest land grabbers of indigenous lands and farmers' homesteads. Very interesting, no? I think, Ninotchka, you said the maninilong draws on those who are dead, and those might not just be the dead humans, but even the land that has been raised by those in power. And as our commenter says, these men in uniforms. But before we dive into more of our insights and our discussion, please do hold on and keep stay on the line for this. We have our next speaker who's joining us via video message. She is a sociologist based at the University of Canberra in Australia. She has written extensively about Duterte's populism, including her latest book, Democracy in a Time of Misery, published last year by Oxford University Press. You might also know her from her book, The Duterte Reader. Everyone, please welcome Dr. Nicole Curato.
Hello, magandang hapon sa inyong lahat. Maraming salamat sa imbitasyon na makasali sa discussion natin ngayong hapon, Demystifying Demagogues and Dictators. Una sa lahat, gusto kong humingi ng pasensya dahil hindi ako makasali ng live. Medyo nagkagulo sa schedule, pero thankful talaga ako na binigyan pa rin ako ng pagkakataon na makaparticipate dito sa Human Rights Film Festival. So, ang gagawin natin, merong 3 tanong na pinadala yung organizer sa akin. So, instead na magbigay ako ng napakahabang lecture tungkol dun sa topic, naisip ko mas maganda na magkaroon tayo ng kumbaga hypothetical conversation about some of your curiosities about the topic, demagogues and dictators. So, simulan na natin. Yung unang tanong, parang essay writing contest. Sige, subukan ko siyang sagutin lahat. Yung unang tanong, how has the Marcos administration, all the way to the current administration, dehumanized its people, and how can we rehumanize ourselves and others in the midst of a decades-long political crisis? So, maraming paraan actually kung paano nangyayari yung dehumanization. Gusto kong i-highlight yung trabaho ng colleague ko, si Dalia Simangan, isa siyang sociologist based sa Hiroshima University. At meron siyang sinulat na papel kung saan pinapatunayan niya na ang nangyayari sa Pilipinas ngayon ay genocide. Yung war on drugs ay isang act of genocide. At isang ang criterion na pinakita niya ay yung dehumanization. So paano ba yun nangyayari? So I think one obvious way in which dehumanization happens is through the politics of naming. So pag tinatawag natin ang kapwa Pilipino natin, halimbawa na addict, na zombie, parang nare-reduce yung tao na yon sa isa lang na identity at dun lang nakafocus yung buong usapan. The entire conversation is focused on that. And pag ganun ang nangyayari, very subhuman yung treatment, di ba? Nadja-justify na pwede silang patayin, pwede nang walang due process kasi nga hindi na sila tao. At nakikita rin natin yun pagdating sa approach, hindi lang ng Duterte regime, pero ng mga nakaraang regime, pagdating sa mga sabihin na nating mga aktivista or mga rebelde na nahuhuli ng militar, marami tayong nabalitaan tungkol sa torture. At torture ang isang I think, grotesque na paraan para ipakita na yung tao ay hindi na tao dahil yung pagtrato sa kanya ay parang pagtrato sa hayop. These are overt, di ba? Overt ways in which people are dehumanized. The peculiarity, I think, of the Duterte administration is that the dehumanization comes from the top. Nanggagaling siya mismo sa presidente. Samantalang yung ibang mga naging presidente, medyo patago pa, medyo pailalim pa yung mga ganitong klaseng approaches. And I think nagdo-double down yan kasi tone from the top, si Duterte na mismo yung nag-dehumanize, tapos na-amplify pa siya sa grassroots, or in fact, hindi nga siya grassroots, astroturf, di ba? Fake grass, in the form of trolls. So nagkakaroon ng napakalawak na narrative of dehumanization pagdating sa war on drugs, pagdating sa terrorism, pagdating sa opposition, na parang hindi na nga sila tao dahil hindi sila sang-ayon sa mga plano ng Duterte regime. Pero sa tingin ko, yung ganong klaseng politics of naming, Oo, nakakatakot siya, pero meron pang ibang mga mas nakakatakot na paraan kung saan na-dehumanize ang mga kapwa Pilipino. So I think these are the less overt forms of how we willfully disregard the suffering of other people. Ang term na ginagamit ng ibang academics dito ay slow violence, na we also witness a lot of forms of violence and dehumanization in less spectacular forms. So when we think about hunger and poverty, extreme poverty, in a way, this is also very dehumanizing kasi nga, basic needs of a human being, hindi natin mabigay or bilang kapwa Pilipino or hindi siya mabigay ng Estado. So, I think magandang pag-isipan na maliban dun sa mga obvious ways of dehumanizing, wag natin kakalimutan yung slow violence, the kind of violence that is less spectacular, the kind of violence that is more hidden. It's hidden not because we can't see it, it's hidden because we are so used to it. So sana pagtuunan din natin yun ng pansin. My second part dun sa question is how we can rehumanize ourselves. And I think napakagandang platform nito ngayon kasi I can really say that storytelling, art and film, even pictures on Instagram or creative forms of activism in TikTok, diba, can also be spaces for us to connect and rehumanize people that are often dehumanized in mainstream conversations, especially using state propaganda. Pero maliban doon, merong isang debate ngayon among academics, and I'm sure debate rin to in mainstream conversations, is that dahil nga parang ang hirap ng pag-usapan ng politika ngayon, lalo na kung meron tayong mga kaibigan or kamag-anak na medyo taliwas sa mga pinapaniwalaan natin, lalo na pagdating sa human rights. Merong isang part, I guess, of this conversation na sinasabi, baka naman dapat ang i-cultivate natin na spaces ngayon when it comes to living with each other, maybe we have to cultivate spaces that's free of politics. Mahalaga yung mga politics-free spaces daw kasi we have to develop civic friendships, and these are the kinds of friendships that will allow us to treat each other as human beings while bracketing or parang temporarily suspending our political differences. Kaya yung mga bagay tulad ng football, K-drama, skincare, kung ano man yan, yung mga entertainment or yan, panlibang, mahalaga daw siyang spaces kung saan makaka-relate tayo sa ibang kapwa Pilipino at nakikita natin sila bilang kapwa Pilipino rather than tagging them as people whose views are very different from ours. So baka yun yung dapat nating i-rebuild bilang isang lipunan. But that's just one part of the debate. I also understand na pwede pang ganun yun kung ang debate na nga is ang daming namamatay. We literally see people die around us. Pwede pa rin bang isuspend yung politics? Can we still just say we can bracket our differences if the person that we are engaging with is someone who actually supports killings, is someone who actually supports suppression of freedom of speech? So medyo challenging yung debate na yun. Pero siguro maganda siyang pag-usapan somehow sa discussion mamaya. If we do need spaces free of politics so we can appreciate each other as humans and not just political actors. Okay, ang dami ko nang nasabi. Naka 7 minutes na ako. 15 minutes lang yung binigay sa akin. The second question is, how is the government framing the pandemic, the drug problem, the communist insurgency, and civil society resistance? Has it been effective in terrorizing and spreading fear amongst the masses and justifying their actions? Why or why not? Okay, essay question ulit. Ang parati ko namang sinasabi when it comes to the Duterte administration is that it presents itself as a wartime regime, di ba? Nagsimula siya sa war on drugs, napunta tayo sa war on Marawi, napunta tayo sa war against the virus, tapos meron tayong, well, feeling nila war against the oligarchs, pero sino bang naniniwala dyan, di ba? But I think the problem there is when we frame politics using the language of war, nadja-justify nga ang violence, nadja-justify ang paggamit ng militar. Very interesting kasi sa pandemic, di ba, ang talagang frontliners naman dito lumalabas, militar at police, para i-enforce yung mga lockdown rules, para i-enforce yung social distancing rules, whereas other countries take a more medicalized public health approach to the pandemic. Pero hindi na rin, di ba, nakakagulat kasi the drug problem is a health problem. And yet, ang response from the get-go ng Duterte administration is to securitize this problem. So, I think dahil nga war yung language, dahil ang framing ay nasa gera tayo for the past how many years, madaling ang ma-justify ang suppression of our rights, suppressions of our freedoms, kasi parating nasa emergency na lang tayo parate, nasa gera na lang tayo parate. But having said that, I'm also very careful not to frame this as a Duterte problem. Kasi at least with the work that I do, doing a lot of field work with communities that actually support President Duterte, ang napapansin ko rin naman is that, oo, tama, nakakatakot nga yung nangyayari sa Pilipinas ngayon, especially if we see it from the perspective of governance. Pero sana wag na natin makakalimutan na pakinggan yung tinatawag na everyday fears ng mga ordinaryong Pilipino. Parati akong tinatanong ng international media bakit sikat pa rin si Duterte sa Pilipinas. I think it's because pagkagising naman sa umaga ng isang pamilya na nakatira sa isang slum community, hindi naman si Duterte yung una nilang iniisip, hindi naman si Duterte yung una nilang kinakatakot. Ang una nilang kinakatakot is baka dumating na yung mga siga na pinagkautangan nila at wala silang pambayad. Ang kinakatakot nila, baka mapaalis sila dun sa bahay na tinitirhan nila kasi 5 months na silang hindi nakapagbabayad ng rent. Ang kinakatakutan nila, baka bukas maendo sila. So, these are everyday fears, these are everyday terrors that poor Filipinos experience. So, sa tingin ko, yung challenge is for us to connect the terror that we feel from above to the terror that they feel from below. Malinaw ba yun? Okay, i-Twitter message nyo na lang ako pag medyo nalabuan kayo. Okay, last question. As an academic, what are your thoughts on how we can unveil the monsters that are destroying the core values our nation was built upon? Okay, so pasok nga siya sa tema of this entire film festivals about unveiling the monsters, diba? Okay, there are obviously many answers to this question, so I think I will just like to focus on what I would call micro-political forms of violence. So, siguro parang, of course, alam naman natin na ang daming ang monsters na na-unveil ng Duterte regime na to, and even more confronting is when we meet people that, ano ba, parang yung medyo nakakagulat na, bakit biglang carry lang sa kanila na may extrajudicial killings, diba? Parang those kinds of monsters have always been unveiled. But I think what I want to emphasize in this last question is how can we also unveil the less obvious forms of monsters that we experience in our democracies, and sometimes we are the very same people that perpetuate those monsters. What do I mean? So when I talk about micro-political forms of violence, ito yung mga paraan kung saan yung mga values ng democracies, plural, yung values ng democracy, tayo mismo yung nagko-curtail, hindi lang natin masyadong napapansin. Ang daming halimbawa, silencing strategies na parang that serve to humiliate people who try to take part in political conversations. So expressions like, daming alam. I know it's an expression, I know it's harmless, but sometimes these expressions are used to silence others, diba? Na parang, huwag ka na magsalita, dami mong alam. That, I think, is a micro-political form of silencing, which obviously is a monster that we always have to contend with in our everyday life. Or when we think about younger people who want to take part in politics, tapos biglang kukuyugin sa social media, sasabihin, you're not woke enough. I think that is also another form of micro-political, not violence, maybe violence is a strong word, but parang smaller forms of monsters that close conversations instead of encouraging people to speak up more and engage with them. So, why am I saying this? Baka some of you might think, ang babaw naman, yan ang struggle mo talaga, yung mga silencing strategies on social media. Actually, struggle siya talaga kasi I think this is how solidarities are corroded. Malinaw naman for people who want to fight the excesses and abuses of this regime. Malinaw naman kung sino yung kalaban, di ba? Malinaw naman na ang kalaban natin ay abuse of power. Pero ang nagiging problema is how we can organize ourselves together. And especially if we're thinking about the next elections. So I think solidarities should not be corroded by silencing strategies and these micro-political monsters that we unleash on each other. Totoo naman, nakakapagod lumaban, especially if the monsters you're fighting are monsters within. So obviously, wala akong karanasan dito. Hindi naman ako magpapanggap that I'm part of any political movement or activist organization. I see myself as someone who is keeping a critical distance from these movements, supporting, but also trying to be vocal, to speak out and lend some insight just to facilitate reflection. So I think in conclusion, bilang meron na lang akong 40 seconds. Bilang pagtatapos, siguro ang gusto ko lang na mensahe na ma-impart in my contribution this afternoon is the importance of micropolitics. We can always think about everything that's wrong in the system, but we know that everyday struggles are what constitute our aspirations and our strategies to fight and change the system. So let's also be mindful of the own monsters that we create and how we can get rid of those monsters through, I would say, democratic practices in our everyday lives. So maraming salamat ulit sa invitation. If you want to keep the conversation going, I'm on Twitter and feel free to reach out. For now, bye and thank you.
Maraming salamat, Nicole. Thank you for sending us your video message. Definitely a lot of points to ponder. No? How do we fight the monsters within? How do we incorporate democratic values and our stance in everyday life? And what do we do with that? How do we move forward from here? Is there a remedy to the apathy and amnesia that we seem to face in our generation, in previous generations and beyond? Now, to discuss that with us, we have an op-ed contributing writer, a spoken word artist, and a poet who was accepted as a poetry fellow for 2 national writers' workshops. His op-ed articles have appeared in ANCX, Inquirer, Rappler, and Scout, while his poems can be found in Likhaan, the Journal of Contemporary Philippine Literature from UP Press. Cha, an Asian literary journal, Cordite Poetry Review, and the Quarterly Literary Review Singapore, among others. Everyone, please welcome Mr. Alfonso Manalastas.
Hello. Thank you for that generous introduction, Mitch, and thank you to 𝐃𝐞𝐦𝐲𝐬, of course, for creating this platform in order to gather, I guess, people of today, and to sort of engage us in conversations that try to not just reminisce, but sort of interrogate and radicalize our collective memory as a people in relation to the martial law and in relation to the Marcos dictatorship as a whole. And I think my contribution, I guess, to this discussion will mostly be about not just the work of artists, but cultural work in general. Because looking back in history, I think it was pretty clear coming from the Marcos era that they knew how to deploy cultural capital in order to justify their place in power and in order to sustain their place in power. In fact, when you look at certain inventions of the martial law, for example, you can look at examples such as the National Artist. You can look at examples such as the Manila International Film Festival with this very grotesque, very morbid history of rushing the construction of a building that ended in a tragedy that caused the deaths of a lot of construction workers, for example, things like this. Because the Marcos family is very aware of the kind of power that cultural capital has in not just instilling individuals into positions of power, but in sustaining those particular positions of power. And I think this is why we need to sort of address this coming from the perspective or coming from the lens of a present generation, a younger generation that's trying to memorialize that time in history, not just trying to lay out the facts, but also trying to historicize it and really contextualize it. And I think there are 3 ways that we can try to revisit it and radicalize this sort of collective memory. And then the first one, of course, is we need educators, we need historians to double down their work. Because if you look at the enemy right now, you're looking at free YouTube content that's being fabricated in order to serve as propaganda to justify the Marcos era and to sort of defend it. And I feel like when we're talking about this type of democratic content that's available for virtually anyone that has access to the internet, and we talk about the misinformation that's being peddled in these particular spaces, we need to also be able to contradict them or to counter them by creating spaces that are as democratic, but also has the credibility and the authority of educators, of historians, of cultural workers, something that can lend some sense of wisdom in these types of information. Because I think one of the more dominant narrative that's being peddled by Marcos apologists that I've witnessed online is that they're not necessarily pro Marcos, but why not lay down the facts? Why not lay down the good and the bad and let people decide for themselves? Well, I think that this is not only unfair to the integrity and the sanctity of these facts, but it's also morally dishonest, because it's not like you can quantify the value of a new bridge, for example, in relation to the value of actual human lives, as though you can trade them off for each other, as though you can say that it's okay to kill 5 people if you have one San Juanico bridge anyway. And I think that's not only unfair, but I think it also lacks context. Such as, for example, one of the things that's often deployed by Marcos apologists in today's discourse is that look at all the infrastructure projects such as the Philippine Heart Center, without actually contextualizing the fact that the Philippine Heart Center was a grand Valentine's Day gesture by Ferdinand Marcos given to Imelda Marcos at a time when heart complications wasn't necessarily the leading cause of death among Filipinos. It was malaria. But I suppose malaria treatment simply isn't as sexy as a heart center for Valentine's Day. And so these things tend to get muddied in the conversation, especially when you try to contextualize it from the lens of was Marcos necessarily doing it from a place of compassion? Was Marcos necessarily doing it with the best interest of the Filipino people in mind? And I think the answer to that is an unequivocal no. Especially seeing that this wasn't, an isolated case. The San Juanico Bridge was also a gift to Imelda. All of these grand gestures weren't necessarily done in the interest of the people, but were done in the interest of individuals that were close to the powers involved. And I think, or even, for example, when you talk about new roads, how these roads were done as a way to sort of whitewash or sort of justify the global loans, for example, to justify the US aid, for example, things like that. And how it sort of set a precedence and how these 2-inch roads, for example, sort of set a precedence for succeeding administrations conducting all of these facade level, face value infrastructure projects in order to justify their spending without actually doing anything to serve the people. And I think that's something that we have to always inspect and something that we always have to be critical about, and not just simply say, oh, but there were this many new roads, this many new bridges, this many new this and that. But also, let's talk about, I guess, the role of cultural work and artists in this larger narrative, because I think even when we go back to the Marcos era, like I said, they knew how to deploy cultural capital as a way to defend the regime, in the same sense that Amy Marcos, for example, served in the film board and oversaw the works of Lino Broca and Ishmael Bernal, and we know that she wasn't particularly intellectual in her observations and her supervision, for example, seeing that Ishmael Bernal and Lino Broca are only two of the times filmmakers who were able to smuggle their political messages in their body of work, and the Marcoses somehow supported them anyway, because they were the ones who possessed that kind of cultural capital that the Marcoses wanted to latch on in order to sustain their power. Seeing that this is the case, it means that today, in order for us to be able to instill some sense of radical empathy and also to go back to what Nicole said, restore some sense of humanity given the blatant and widespread dehumanization that's being perpetuated by the present administration, I think it's important for us to be able to utilize cultural capital, to be able to utilize art in a way that restores some sense of humanity among the people that are being constantly victimized and dehumanized by the state. And how you achieve this is, of course, by constantly creating work that reflects the realities of the people from the grassroots. And, you know, this isn't to say that you're not allowed to write stories about love. In fact, I think it's a disservice to say that people from precarious circumstances, people from impoverished communities do not need these stories to reflect their realities, especially because these are things that are universal. These are things that transcend classes. And I think it's sort of reductive for us to reduce these victims of dehumanization as if they are people who are incapable of, sort of relating to these universal values and universal experiences. And I think the best way for us to be able to restore their humanity is to create art that reflect their reality as it reflects ours. Because I feel like it's the similarities between our lives and theirs, our lives as the middle class and theirs, that ultimately counters this narrative that paints them as though they are not humans to begin with. I think this is important because the populist rhetoric of this government, the present-day government, as well as the martial law, as well as the Marcos dictatorship, for that matter, has always relied on sort of portraying virtuous few, which is often the middle class, and the dangerous others, which is often the lower class, which is often low-income families that are victims of drug abuse, for example, are victims of many things, many social ills that the state is trying to purge. And I think that by blurring those distinctions, I think by sort of corroding those delineations, we do get to restore some sense of humanity, because it allows us to empathize with people who are distinguished from us, people who we are conditioned to believe are different from us, and therefore are our enemies. And I think art is an integral form for us to be able to do that, because as a central feature of art will always be storytelling, and storytelling will allow us to be able to craft narratives that reflect these realities and craft narratives that restore some sense of humanity, which I think makes it an important apparatus when it comes to instilling a sense of radical empathy and portraying not just people for what they are, but also these evil dictators and demagogues also for what they are. And lastly, I think the one thing that we also need to interrogate is artistic production, because when we talk about the kind of methods that are being weaponized by the state in order to convince more people that the Marcos era was also a golden era, you look at free access spaces like YouTube. Once again, you look at the content is democratic. It's everywhere. Everybody has the capacity not just to participate in it, but to navigate it as well. And I feel like we need to be able to interrogate how we as artists also participate in artistic production, and not just artistic production, and not just trying to bridge the gap between us being able to create art and us being able to get that art from point A to point B, but also in how we navigate in how we navigate artistic institutionalization. Like, for example, how Nick Joaquin, for example, was able to leverage on his cultural capital in order to lobby for the Marcoses to release Pete Lacaba, unless otherwise he wouldn't accept his National Artist Award, things like that. And I feel like as artists, we need to be able to zoom in on that aspect of artistic production to see how we can sort of corrode institutions that have been monopolizing content among artists, and at the same time democratize access to these artistic products in order to give access to films, give access to literature, give access to music to as many people as possible, especially when we're trying not just to replicate these conversations among our peers, but to sort of instill them in spaces where they're not necessarily expected to crop up organically. Spaces where political opinions that are hardline, political opinions that are somewhat radical are not necessarily welcome. Personally, what I do as a spoken word artist is I tend to perform my political pieces in spaces where people only expect me to perform love poetry. And I feel like that may not be a dissertation paper that lays down all the facts, that may not have every information that they may need, but what it has is some capacity to sort of stir conversations. What it has is some capacity to raise awareness. What it has is some capacity to evoke some reaction from an audience that does not necessarily expect it. And we always go back to good art being the kind of art that comforts the disturbed and disturbs the comfort of the comfortable. And if you can achieve those things in the context or in the framework of history, in the context, in the framework of memory, in the context in the framework of politics, then I think there is value to that. I think that's it for me for now. So thank you once again.
Thank you, Alfie. I think that's definitely a message that we can all take home, and hopefully there's more to come from you later in the session. But for now, I'd like to thank our panelists so far who've shared all their insights. Iting, Attorney Chel, Ninotchka, Nicole, and obviously Alfie. I think we've seen that there are definitely very wonderful opportunities that have been identified here, while recognizing what we can learn from the past. I think if we can take away two main themes from our 5 speakers for today, I think the first is that when we talk about history, we're not just talking about yellowed papers in textbooks or history books. We're talking about reverberations that from things that have happened before that we feel still now, whether that's in our corrupt and broken justice system, whether that's in the trauma of those who suffered under the dictatorship, or in the divide that exists in our society because of what has been sown during that time. But at the same time, even though we still feel the effects of that history, there is a reinforcement in why we keep telling that history, and that is in the power of the stories that we share with each other day to day. As long as we keep ourselves rooted in the values that we share as Filipinos, and we share our experiences, we share what we have in common, we share these stories and keep these stories alive until we have the vision of a Philippines that we really want and we really deserve. So I think you guys have given us a lot of points to ponder, and we can share that now here in our next session, where we move on into our panel discussion. And so please keep typing in your questions in the Q&A box. Our team behind the scenes have been taking note of your questions, and we'll get to them shortly. However, let's begin our panel discussion with insights from 4 young leaders of this generation. We'll give each one around 3 to 5 minutes to share one key insight based on the speakers' presentations. And in this order, we have our 4 youth reactors. We have Ms. Aura Agbay from the UP Cebu Student Council, Mr. JB Bejarin, sanggunian ng mga mag-aaral ng mga paaralang Loyola ng Ateneo de Manila, and Mr. Will Reyes from the Ateneo Human Rights Center. Apologies, we have 3 reactors. So let's start with Ms. Aura Agbay from the UP Cebu Student Council. Please do share your insights with us today.
Hello, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me in this webinar to share my insights and to witness such meaningful insights from our amazing speakers, and to learn about their firsthand experiences under the brutal administration of the dictator Ferdinand Marcos. So in this webinar, I was asked to react to these talks and to give my insight as part of the young generation of today on facing and resisting the similar terrors, if not worse, that are now perpetrated by the present Duterte administration. So I'm going to start now by pointing out that most of our speakers, if not all, fought during martial law in their youthful years. No, and we also had our speakers, no, young speakers of today, no, detailing how they are fighting currently against the similar administration. So this is a proof that youth really does have a great role not to play in safeguarding democracy and fighting against injustices and in shaping a just and peaceful society as a whole. So even in our history, it is evident no, how the young Bonifacio, the young Rizal, and other Filipino youth throughout our history who struggled against colonization and for liberation. And we can only conclude that the youth really is the best fighting age. You know, we have the time, the strength, the enthusiasm to learn and change society. But the thing here is being young is not the sole requisite no, in order for us to counter and to stand up against the present culture of violence, the state-sponsored killings, and other fascist acts no, under tyrants such as Marcos and Duterte. But we also have to struggle, no, and not just to struggle, but to militantly and decisively struggle, because we have to decide if a country drowned in Filipino blood is good enough for us. We have to decide if we are to settle in a government that steals and pockets our taxes, in a government that chooses to address our legitimate demands through repression, threats, and red tagging. And we have to decide quick, no, because as the day goes by, the number of murdered Filipinos, the number of hungry Filipinos continues to exponentially rise. So as Ms. Rosca discussed earlier about how despite the obvious flags like environment plunder, corruption, economic crisis, political repression, and many more, how did Marcos rule last that long? And we wouldn't want to be asking ourselves that, right? Or worse, be questioned by the future generation. How and why did we let Duterte this far? We already have the history to teach us a lesson and guide us to never let those atrocities happen again. And this is why we have to seriously reject the Marcoses and the fascists of today like Duterte and their desperate attempt not to revise history. And we can start in our own homes in educating our, like what the participants said earlier, our Marcos loyalist relatives, no, kahit medyo mahirap siya and very frustrating. And lastly, no, the final recipe per se in battling demagogues and dictators is our solidarity, not only among the youth, but solidarity with the vast Filipino people. The workers, the farmers, the health workers, the indigenous peoples, and others who are now the most oppressed and marginalized. So as students, we ought to, of course, study, and not just academically, but to study our own society. Just like what we're doing now, no, dissecting the characteristics of dictatorship and societal problems, no, we have to study the situation of our country, and not just from the textbooks, as mentioned earlier, but also in our own communities, to go to the communities, live with the marginalized sectors, know their political and economic situation, and as students, as a metaphor, our exam, shall be our willingness and our effort, to organize and to organize events and conduct liberating actions and to bring what we have learned to communities and to marginalized sectors who are not able to participate in webinars such as this due to a lack of resources and due to, as mentioned earlier, the political situation is the least of their concerns because they still have to attend to their economic needs. So that's our primary role as the youth, to bring what we have learned today to those communities. So that's all. Thank you very much.
Daghang salamat, Aura. Salamat sa inyong insights. And yes, agree, we have to bring it back to our own communities. Next, let's hear from JB from Ateneo Sanggu.
Una sa lahat, maraming salamat sa Active Vista. Salamat sa lahat ng nag-organize ng event na ito. Parang nakakasariwa po na makatanggap ng bagong insights mula sa mga taong nakaranas mismo ng martial law. Hindi ko po alam kung ilan yung nakakapanood ng webinar na to today or yung ilan yung nandun sa Zoom room natin ngayong hapon na ito. Ang dalangin ko lang sana dumami pa tayo sa pagpapatuloy ng mga araw sa webinar series at sa mga iba pang events na kakaharapin natin sa mga susunod na mga araw, buwan at taon. Nais ko lang pong magsimula sa pagsabi na ang ating pagdiwang ng ika-48 na anniversary ng martial law ay makasaysayan sa panahon na ito. Napaka-relevant sa panahon natin ngayon, sa panahon ng pandemya. At napaka-iba rin dahil nga sa kinakaharap ng mundo natin ngayon. It's as if nagiging complex po yung reality na kinakaharap natin. Sa kabila ng complex na nga yung realidad na hinarap ng bansa ng martial law. At complex pa yung kinabukasan na hinaharap natin. Complex being uncertain, complex bilang hindi natin alam kung ano yung kakaharapin natin bukas. At complex sa pagtingin sa ating mga movements ngayon. Bilang magkakaiba tayo ng mga pinaniniwalaan kung paano natin haharapin yung kinabukasan na ito. Pero sa lahat ng pagkakaiba na ito, sa lahat ng complexity na ito, may isa lang po na siguro nagbubuklod sa ating lahat. Kaya tayo nandito sa webinar na to, sa araw na ito. At kahit sinusuportahan mo man si Pangulong Marcos o naniniwala ka man na siya ay isang naging mabuting pangulo sa kasaysayan ng bansang ito o hindi, tayo po ay dumaan sa kasaysayan ng martial law. Yun ay isang bagay na hindi natin maikakaila. At hindi natin maikakaila ang katotohanan na marami pong namatay sa panahon na ito. Naghirap po ang mga Pilipino sa taon na ito, mga taon na ito. At bilang isang bansa, sa tingin ko, meron pa tayong mas magagawa bilang mga Pilipino na mas maganda sa naipakita ng mga panahon sa martial law. Filipinos deserve better than what we experience in martial law. And in saying this, Filipinos deserve better in the future that we face. Ang aking reaction lang po sa lahat ng mga perspektibo na ating napanood ngayon. Importante po na lahat ito, hanapan natin ng paraan na pagtagpi-tagpiin. Ang ibig sabihin ko lang po dito ay ang lahat ng perspektibong ito ay mahalaga. Kung na-notice niyo po, iba-iba po yung mga perspectives. Ang tendency po ay mawala sa lahat ng mga natanggap nating katotohanan. Pero parte po siya ng isang general narrative. At ang maganda po sa pag-commemorate sa anibersaryo ng martial law ay ito ay karanasan mula sa nakaraan na sinusubukan nating alalahanin ngayon, hindi lamang alalahanin kundi dalhin sa ating realidad sa kinabukasan. At ito po ay napaka-relevant sa panahon natin ngayon dahil na nga sa mga karanasan natin hindi lamang sa ilalim ng Administrasyong Duterte kundi pagkatapos na rin ng EDSA, kung saan marami pa rin pong naghihirap, kung saan marami pa rin po ang hindi nakakatanggap ng dekalidad na edukasyon, kung saan marami pa rin po ang namamatay sa ilalim ng mga state forces. Dahil kung mas napaunlad sana natin ang bansa natin pagkatapos ng EDSA, sana hindi natin kailangan tumira sa isang mundo kung saan puno ng naratibo, ng fake news, at disinformation tungkol sa kasaysayan ng ating bansa. E di sana lahat tayo ay nakaka-access ng mga ganitong resources gaya ng webinars. Sana tayong lahat ay mas ligtas at mas nabubuhay ng wala sa pangamba. Ito po yung mga perspektibo na kailangan nating dalhin sa pagharap natin sa kinabukasan. Oo, mahalaga ang misyon. Misyon natin para buksan ang isip ng ating mga kababayan ukol sa mga katotohanan na nangyari sa nakaraan. Ngunit ang katotohanan rin ay mayroon silang sariling pinanggagalingan at kailangan nating magtangpo sa gitna nito para makauswag o makausad bilang isang bansa. We need to meet from both ends. We need to meet the marginalized sectors from both ends. And kung sa pag-organize pa nga lang po, napakahirap na. Organizing between youth groups is a very difficult and magnanimous task in doing. Paano pa kaya ang pakikipag-organisa sa mga sektor na hindi natin nakakasalamuha sa pang-araw-araw? Mga sektor na nabubuhay sa parehas na bansa, ngunit ibang-ibang realidad. Ito po yung kailangan nating bitbitin na perspektibo. Pero sa pag-meet po ng iba't ibang tao sa gitna, siguro nandito rin yung tanong na paano kung hindi sila makarating sa gitna. Ito po siguro yung pagkakataon natin na tignan na kailangan nating tagpuin ang mga tao kung nasaan sila. We need to meet people from where they are. Yun lang po ang aking mensahe ngayon. Sana patuloy pa rin ang ganitong pag-oorganisa. Maraming salamat sa Vista. Bukas po ang Ateneo Sanggu sa anumang kolaborasyon. At ito po ay pagkakataon para sa ating lahat na sama-samang mamuno bilang mga kabataan at bilang mga Pilipino sa ating hinaharap. Marami pa po tayong pagsubok kakaharapin. Hindi lamang ngayon o sa susunod na taon, hindi lamang sa 2022, kundi sa mga susunod pang mga taon. Maraming salamat po.
Maraming salamat, JB, at salamat sa efforts nyo, lalo na sa inyo sa Sanggu at sa iba pang mga nandito sa call natin sa Zoom na representatives ng youth sector. Agree, mahirap ang ginagawa nyo pag-organisa ng kabataan. Pero yes, dapat tayo ay magtagpuan kung saan naman tayo magkikita. So, padayon lang. And lastly, let's have our final reactor, Mr. Will Reyes from the Ateneo Human Rights Center.
Magandang tanghali. Siguro sa forum na to, kung may gusto akong share, siguro itong 3 points na to. First, yung language at saka paano natin i-embody yung lengguwahe na ginagamit natin, diba? So, language, when we have conversations, diba, about these different aspects ng konsepto na natutunan din natin, parang we should learn na engage them in a language that they would understand, diba? And in our way of showing na ganito ang nangyari noon at nangyayari ulit ngayon, maintindihan nila kung bakit kailangan natin matuto, diba? Kung bakit natin hindi na dapat ulit-ulitin na naman itong mga diktator na to na umuupo na naman at pumupwesto na naman para ulitin na naman ang mga bagay na dapat na pagtutunan natin, no? So, lahat tayo advocates tayo ng human rights. Lahat tayo advocates tayo ng democracy, di ba? So, ngayon, kapag sa ating interaction, dapat itong advokasya natin ng demokrasya, itong advokasya natin ng human rights, makikita natin to na isinasabuhay natin, di ba? So, sa sasabuhay natin ng human rights, di ba? Dapat matuto tayong may pag-engage in a respectful way wherein yung mga lengguwahe, yung engagement natin with people na hindi katulad natin sa opinion natin, di ba? Kaya nating ilagay ang lengguwahe na maintindihan nila at matatanggap nila, di ba? Ang isa pang importanteng duty is my second point is to create spaces like yung mga speakers natin sinasabi kanina, to create spaces where we can engage these people na kaya natin silang imulat at hindi lang tayo-tayo lang. Kasi ang kinakatakot nga daw ng pagtubo ng social media is magkaroon ng balkanisasyon ng mga ideya. Kung saan yung mga tao na pare-pareho ang konsepto or they agree upon themselves kung ano yung concept na papaniwalaan nila, sila-sila lang yung magsasama-sama. Which would actually not produce progress in any way. Kasi hindi tayo mapag-engage with other people. And hindi tayo magkakaroon ng sense of thesis and anti-thesis that would later on go ahead to progress. And speaking of progress, we should always remember, yun nga, di ba sinabi ni Alfonso kanina, na hindi mo pwedeng i-value ang isang buhay gamit kung gano'ng kadaming buildings ang nagawa, di ba? Always remember that from our interactions, we should always think na tao pa rin sila. Hindi lang sila numbers, di ba? Mas madaling i-appreciate daw yung isang building kasi nakikita mo, may sense of existence siya na nakikita ng araw-araw. Pero, tas yung mga report natin na meron na naman namatay tungkol sa war on drugs or meron na naman violation, numbers lang lumalabas sa news. Let's not forget na behind those numbers, tao sila. Tao pa rin. Isang anak, isang tatay, isang ina. Baka kapwa natin estudyante, katulad ni Kian, di ba? So, sa dinami-dami ng mga nangyari sa history natin, from the point where Marcos became a dictator, we try to learn. We should try and to learn this. Kasi kahit na hindi natin abutan, and I think majority of the reactors now, or if not, lahat talaga, hindi namin naabutan yung Marcos area. Pero, we need to learn from the experiences of the older generation. And alamin natin at makialam tayo, di ba? Makialam tayo as well. Kung ano yung nangyari, ano yung atrocities, at i-share natin ito. Kasi coming from our positions of privilege, that we are educated, that we have this privilege to actually learn and actually in the position to share this to other people, we should engage in the language that they can understand this. We should embody whatever we're saying, whatever we're doing, diba? And provide spaces for them that we can engage them in the level that we can share, as well as iangat natin sila. Diba? Besides that, we've discussed as well yung political cycle ng Philippines. Again, hindi tayo natuto in a sense na wala tayong chance after Marcos to actually establish kung ano nga ba ang martial law nun, di ba? It was pointed out na after Marcos, si Cory na sobrang dami namang kudeta, so hindi natin na-establish again yun. It was pointed out again na the subsequent presidents actually were not in a position of authority to speak of Marcos. Kasi nga si FVR was actually a leader of Marcos during that time as well. And the subsequent naman, hindi naman either apologies or they support Marcos as well. So, may mga systems na inculcate sa atin. And it starts with us. Diba? In breaking these barriers, in art, diba? Like what Activista is doing, na we try to transcend boundaries. And we continue to strive for something bigger. At para meron tayong ma-share pa sa iba. My last point would be, we are in a position now na nare-realize ulit natin na meron na namang red flags. At hindi tayo naniniwala sa Jollibee na mas masarap daw ang red flags, di ba? Pero, guys, I want to share to you na we should never forget whatever right now as well. Never forget again today. Thank you and have a pleasant Monday.
Thank you, Will, and thank you as well, our reactors, our J and JB. I encourage our panelists now to turn on their video so that we can proceed to our Q&A discussion session. Let's do a first round. I think Will mentioned the question of progress. Umunlad ba talaga tayo since the martial law era? Can we have a round of reactions to answer the question on a scale of 1 to 10? How would you rate the country's progress with regards to being progressive or pro-human rights from the martial law era? Let's start in chronological order with Ms. Iting.
Oh, human rights and what is that again? The economic situation?
More human rights and democracy. Would you rate it from a scale of 1 to 10?
With 10 as the highest?
10 is the highest.
Na 10 is very good, like that?
Yes.
Oh, I think it was bad. Really bad. Kung sakaling mayroon pa tayong negative pa nga eh. Kasi,
so kung sa martial law and compared to now, so if you were to give martial law a grade and then today, what would they be?
Today kasi, I think there's also martial law now, pero they clothe it eh. May anti-terror bill na tayo eh. So, parang noon, klaro, na dineclare talaga. Ngayon, labo-labo. Ang klaro lang nilang dineclare is the one in Marawi, right? Pero ito naman sa the rest of the Philippines, ang anti-terror bill ang passed by Congress. So, kung how I would rate then and now, ako sa tingin ko, when it comes to the corruption, the plunder, basically pareho lang yan. Maybe the difference is anang na-highlight sa panahon ni Marcos, si Marcos at saka pamilya niya ang talagang makita mong nagpa-plunder. Sa ngayon, labo-labo. So many people are very much involved, but of course they are connected to each other. So there is a similarity, pero pagdating sa how many people ang napatay, my God, I think mas madaming napatay ngayon. And we don't have a clear count, no? Because of all this drug campaign that they're doing. But mag-backtrack lang ako, ha? Kasi actually during the martial law days ni Marcos, there were also a lot of massacres which has not been properly documented. So we don't have a clear idea kung how many people were really killed in these massacres. At madami dyan nangyari sa Mindanao. So the Muslim people are the one who bore the brunt of these massacres. And in fact, some of the groups there now are still trying their best to document kung saan ba nangyari itong mga massacres na ito and how many communities or people were involved in these massacres. Hindi pa ganun ka-clear ang data dyan na gaano kadami. So, well, sa ngayon, kung yung mga pinatay na mga tao, well, madami din tayong mga human rights activists ngayon na pinapatay. Kagaya yan before, sa Marcos years, pareho lang din yan. So, I don't really know, honestly, kung tanungin mo ako, ano bang mas grabe? Yung noon or yung ngayon, parang feeling ko, parang pareho lang sila sa grabe. Sa pagkagrabe ng sitwasyon ngayon at saka noon. Yun yung masasabi ko.
I think maraming nag-share po ng opinion na yan sa ating comment section. Attorney Chel, how about you as the dean of first dean of the LSIU Law School? Ano yung kung magbibigay ka ng grade sa martial law noon versus anong nangyayari ngayon? What would you give?
Well, nung panahon ng martial law noon, hindi naman nila kinikilala yung human rights. So ang bibigay kong grade doon, 0 o negative pa nga. Pero ito ang masasabi ko. Martial law actually gave birth to the first generation of human rights lawyers and human rights defenders. At talagang naging sakripisyo para sa kanila na manindigan para sa karapatang pantao. Many of that first generation were harassed, arrested, tortured, and killed. At kung hindi dahil sa kanila, palagay ko hindi mangyayaring EDSA. Kaya dapat bigyan natin sila ng pagpupugay dahil it's their courage that led eventually to what became EDSA. Of course, after EDSA, nagkaroon tayo ng panibagong konstitusyon, talagang naging highlighted yung human rights. Masasabi natin, halos yung buong konstitusyon natin ng 1987 ay talagang oriented sa human rights. Meron na siyang Commission on Human Rights at talagang we can say that the legal framework was designed for the protection of human rights. And slowly, although there were lots of stops and starts, from that time, we were slowly but surely progressing in terms of human rights. Until around 2015, halos yung mga human rights groups na dati talagang kaaway ng mga nasa pamahalaan, lalo na yung nasa kapulisan at nasa militar, we were actually the ones conducting already human rights training within the AFP and within the PNP. So slowly but surely, parang nai-absorb na rin kahit sa pulis natin at sa militar, meron na silang sarili-sariling human rights offices within those two organizations. Kaya it was moving forward. Marami pa rin problema, pero may EJK pa rin, marami pa rin mga human rights violations. But nonetheless, we were at least going in a positive direction until 2016 came around. At parang nag-full circle tayo na bumalik tayo sa dati. Mismo yung Pangulo na yung nanlalait ng human rights, mismo yung Pangulo na yung nagsasabing, baliwala yung human rights na yan, ang mahalaga ay human life. He was the one really pushing fake news about human rights. Kasi sa totoo lang, human rights is all about human life. Kaya nga tayo may karapatang pantao, doon yung pagkakaiba natin sa hayop. Kung walang human rights, pwede kang hulihin, pwede kang ilagay sa kulungan ng aso. Pwede kang tratuhin na hayop. Kasi nga wala ng human rights. Kaya ako, as a human rights lawyer, human rights defender for more than 30 years, talagang hindi ko lang kinagagalit, kinalulungkot ko yung mga pinagkakalat nilang mali-mali tungkol sa human rights. And I think that if I were to give a grade to this administration, it would be the same, even a worse grade than the Marcos administration. Kasi by now, dapat tanggap na natin lahat yan. At si Duterte, abogado yan. Nanay nga niya, lumaban nga sa diktadurya. Kaya hindi ko maintindihan kung bakit ganun ang pananaw niya sa human rights.
Salamat sa insights, Attorney Chel. Ninotchka, any thoughts on progress then and now?
Yes. Consider that I left the Philippines and only returned in 1986. I left the Philippines 5 years into martial law. And then I returned in 1986. And I was going back almost every 2 years, sometimes every year, until 2016. I was there in 2016 during the election campaign. And I have not returned. So my sense of peril from both the martial law government of Marcos and this anti-terror government of Duterte, they're just about equal. Yeah. I think the one notable difference is that Mr. Duterte's killings are done in broad daylight and in public. That's a little too blatant even for me. You know, you have videotapes of people getting killed in the middle of the street. It's really something we did not quite see at the time of Marcos. Usually, that's why they had the term salvaging, because the killings were done by stealth, by and large. So, grade 0, negative 0.
Thanks, Ninotchka. And Alfie, how about you?
I would have to agree with the rest of the panel. Of course, I don't have the lived experience of having been through martial law during the Marcos dictatorship, but of course, it wasn't that too. It wasn't, it's not a myth. It's only a little over 30 years ago. And so these are things that are well documented by a lot of historians. These are things that are well documented by a lot of academics. There are tons of available empirical evidence to prove that the things that happened during the Marcos law in relation to human rights abuses did in fact happen. And so I feel like leading to today, from the Marcos era, there have been some significant improvements. There may have been some significant improvements, if not in the actual application of the law, because we know that there were still a lot of like massacres that happened from FBR, Arroyo, Erap Estrada, Pinoy. There were still a lot of human rights violations that happened, especially ones that are targeted against peasant communities, ones that are targeted against activists, against environmentalists even. But I think what sets them apart from the Marcos era and the Duterte regime is that these two administrations were very clear that human rights are unimportant, that human rights only corrode progress, only preclude us from achieving what it believes to be important values, such as, for example, during the Marcos era, everything was done in service of the new society that it was trying to build. All its inventions were done in relation to creating that new society. And in today, the same populist rhetoric that tries to categorize society between the dangerous few versus the virtuous few, rather, versus the dangerous others. And I think that makes these two particular administrations clearly worse than every other administration that existed between the both of them. And I would agree. If I could have a negative score for them, I would give them a negative score. They're terrible. I mean, like, if the numbers, I'm not sure if, because like what the previous panelists have said, we don't really have the exact numbers, especially because the difference between today and then is that we didn't have social media then, for example, to be able to document independently these particular killings, at least independent from the numbers being produced by the state. But then at the same time, today, a lot of these particular killings that are being tagged as extrajudicial are being confused for actual legitimate operations. And so numbers can be very tricky in that sense. But I would say that they're similarly evil, they're similarly terrible, and that we need to be, and if there's anything we learned from history, it's that we did not treat the Marcos administration with enough viciousness to keep them from being able to apply themselves or assert themselves into this political spectrum all over again. Meaning, if we're going to purge today's generation from the same evils that we dealt with back in the 70s and the 80s, we have to treat it with more viciousness. We have to treat it with more, I guess, with more teeth. Yun.
Thanks, Alfie. I think the consensus is bagsak, both then and now. Just interrupting the discussion, Attorney Chel has to leave for another meeting. Thank you so much for joining us. We understand that today is such a busy day for you, but we really are honored by your presence and really appreciate your insights. And we hope to engage with you more in the future. And hopefully there are future Attorney Chels in this audience, and hope you're inspired by that. And so coming from our evaluation, no, kung ano yung nangyayari noon at ano ang nangyayari ngayon, it's sort of the same but different, you know. And right now we have been hearing the same questions again of how did we get here and what can we do? And a lot of the questions from our commenters are around changing people's minds. How did we let this happen, one, and how do we engage those who still insist to this day that what happened then and what is happening now is acceptable. So we'd love to get your perspectives, especially from Ninotchka, Alfie, from your perspectives as writers. And I know, Ms. Iting, you also have a book out. So you guys are storytellers in your own rights. As Nicole said, are stories the answer? How do we begin engaging those who are on the other side of the fence? So siguro let's start in reverse order naman. Alfie, ikaw ulit.
Okay, so I guess I'll pick up from what Nicole said earlier about how we don't want to alienate fence-sitters, how we don't want to alienate potential allies using language that can be more or less hostile. And I know that this can be a little demanding for somebody who feels like there's so much oppression and violence going on that the only way for us to be able to deal with it is with absolute admonition, with absolute condemnation. And I struggle with it as well, very deeply, especially in my personal circles. I come from Butuan City. Butuan is largely supportive of this administration, despite its glaring deficiencies and despite its glaring and blatant abuses in terms of human rights. And so I deal with people who I disagree with a lot. And so I feel like as storytellers, it means that we have some level of awareness and we ascribe some level of wisdom over the language that we deploy. And I feel like this is something that we can manipulate in order to not to get more people on our side, but to get more people to understand, get more people to open their eyes, get more people to want to investigate on their own, want to study these facts, study history, even out of their own volition. And I think, once again, going back, I feel like because storytelling is a central feature of art, and because personally that's my medium. It's what I feel. It's the method. It's the language. It's the imagination. I feel most strongly with, and so I will always gravitate to art. But I feel like people can rely on other areas of strength as well. People who believe that this particular administration, as well as the Marcos administration, who see them as social evils, can sort of package their political messages using their own particular sets of strengths. And I'm not sure how to achieve that really with, say, science or with, say, other forms of artistic genres. But for my own, I like to tell stories not because there's a good story to tell, but because it reflects some sense of reality that's happening on the ground, and because I feel like there's an important message that can be unpacked from these particular narratives.
Thanks, Alfie. Ninotchka, anything to add on your end?
Well, I'm a writer, but I'm also an organizer. Yes, and an agitator if needed. Now, there was a very important advice that was given to me when I was starting as a student activist. I was already pretty well known as a writer at the time. And this person who came from the old movement said to me, "You do not politicize the writing. You politicize the writer. Because if you do a formulaic story, then it fails." So for me, that is the most important thing. It's not enough to just write. You have to be an organizer, an agitator, etc., etc. Maybe because I am a woman, and a woman is expected, or was, and probably even today, expected to be multitasking, even in movements. Yes. You deliver a lecture and you cook the dinner. That's it.
Hopefully, it sounds like with folks like JB, one of our reactors, being one of the organizers, there's more and more of us who are doing this. So that's something that I think their generation can definitely continue and even expand. All right, Ma'am Iting, any thoughts on our storytelling?
She's mute.
I think you're on mute.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes,
Okay.
we can hear you.
We have a great challenge now, which we did not have during martial law, some Marcos years. We now have social media. And I think the present people who do not believe in human rights are really using it to the best of their abilities, no? And they have a lot of money to do this. So, yun ang pinakamalaking problema natin ngayon because many of our young people also are very active in social media. So how do we counter those things? Kaya natutuwa nga ako ngayon na what we are doing in times of COVID, that we have these kinds of mga webinars because it can reach many people immediately in different areas of the Philippines. Kami kasi sa Bantayog, we have a speakers group so we go around the different schools. A majority of our ikot is only in Metro Manila. Wala naman kaming resources to go out of Metro Manila. Pero itong mga ganitong klaseng webinars, malaking bagay ito that we can go beyond the Metro Manila area and get involved young people. Ako, I fully believe that kailangan ng mga kabataan ngayon to be part of this, of making your own stories now. Because the situation demands that you really have to participate. At ito yung palagi kong tinatanong sa mga kabataan when I go to the schools. Do you love this country? Kasi yung ibang mga bansa, kung tanungin yung mga kabataan nila, sa Japan, mahal ba yung ng mga Japanese ang Japan? Ang sagot naman, oo. Sa Pilipino, kung tinatanong ko yun, do we love the Philippines? There is a silence Hindi sila immediately sumasagot na, yes, ganun kaklaro. Ang iba pa nga tumatawa. So I find that very discouraging na hindi malinaw sa ating mga kabataan ngayon kung tatanungin mo sila, do you love our country? Because during our times, klaro yun Klaro yun sa amin. Kaya nga kami participated in the underground movement. Pero ngayon, malabo siya. Hindi siya ganun ka-clear immediately. So my message is always this, nobody else will love our country. Tayo lang talaga. You cannot expect other countries to love the Philippines. And let's that be very clear in our minds. So yun yung ano ko sa mga
Agreed,
stories
yeah.
natin ngayon.
I'm glad to hear no, na a lot of what you guys have shared, medyo positive, proactive na solutions or at least interventions sa mga issues na nangyayari ngayon. However, there's been a growing trend of people, even in, let's say, the pro-human rights community, the progressive community, suggesting less palatable interventions such as actually censoring those who are sharing misinformation or disinformation about the Marcos era. So we have a question from Aldi Samson na, should we endeavor to censor pro-Marcos, pro-martial law content? If it were possible, would the silencing of that thought help prevent the rise of tyranny in the future? I invite any one of our panelists to jump in.
I guess I'll be the first. I think we need to contextualize what these sort of pro-Marcos rhetorics are that are in question, that we want to maybe censor or not. And I feel like censorship as a sweeping statement can seem daunting and can seem like such a violent term, in fact, when it comes to free speech. So I feel like we have to treat those particular pro-Marcos rhetoric, we need to be able to understand them better and see if these are peddled lies, if these are false information. Because if so, then we have definitely absolute responsibility to censor them the way we censor every other fake news. That's about pretty much every other political preferences. But if these are pro-Marcos arguments that are being wielded that are fair and sound and are about, about how they like the Marcos era, because yes, there were a lot of killings and yes, this and that, but at least Manila was beautiful, for example, which is obviously a very skewed standard to have, and obviously very intellectually dishonest and morally wrong, but isn't entirely untrue either. If those are the standards being set by the people who are arguing for those things. But I don't think that's, the argument here. I don't think anybody's really arguing that at least the times were beautiful. Yes, people were dying, but at least the times were beautiful. I think it takes a morally corrupt person to argue those things. But if I guess those are the arguments being peddled, then fine. I think people are smart. I rely on people's intelligence, that they're smart enough to be able to say that, you know what, I don't care if Manila was beautiful. I don't care about all the new buildings that they built, especially for the arts, if it means that people were dying, if it means that people were starving, if it means that a lot of land grabbing was happening, if a lot of cronyism, it give birth to cronyism and whatnot. These are non-negotiables that we're trying to weigh as values here. But going back, I guess if it's absolute fake news, then we also have the absolute responsibility to take it out of the spectrum, to remove it from, to separate it and remove it from the conversations that are happening, from the mainstream discourse, in order to not poison, I guess, those conversations. Make sure that they're still healthy and they're still elevated. They still elevate the discourse to, another level.
Thanks,
Michelle.
Alfie. Yes, po.
Ako, I don't believe in censorship. I believe there should be a freedom of different ideas that should be heard by everyone. And in the play of those different ideas, incumbent on us to study so that malalaman natin kung sino bang who are peddling false ideas and who are telling the truth. Kaya sa akin, hindi mo mahinto yun eh. The more you will censor it, the more para silang kawawa. Diba? The more makakuha sila ng mga mag-side sa punto sa kanila kasi nga, you are censoring them, you are persecuting them. So ako sa tingin ko, let it all be out in the open. And let us do our jobs. Tayo na alam yung anong nangyari na totoo, then let us do our work. Seriously, let us study the past and let us talk about it like what we are doing now. And look at and use other medium kung ano pa ba ang pwede nating gamitin para maka-reach tayo ng wider audience. Ako nga, ito, I don't know, maybe some activists will not like what I will say now. Pero ako, I believe that there are still good people pa rin inside the military. No, I don't think they're all bad eh. There are good people there, babae or lalaki man sila. Kaya lang, syempre, ang naha-highlight natin ngayon, yung mga namamatay tao, etc., etc. But there are good people there. And I hope that these good people who are inside the military will defend the country, really defend it, not sell it out. Like, sa ngayon, pinapayagan nila itong Chinese, ano tong telco, na mag-set up ng towers nila inside the military, madali na lang tayong i-monitor yung intelligence natin. It's a sellout. So ako sa tingin ko, let us not censor. Let the ideas be out in the open. Let us study and do our work and tell what is the truth and influence as many as possible. That's how I see it.
Yes, very well said. Ninotchka, any final thoughts to wrap up?
To wrap up, I think we should make sure next time that full justice is attained by the people when the wheel turns, because the wheel will turn. Our primary mistake during the Marcos era and the end of the era was allowing certain members of the cabal to go scot-free, to keep what they had looted and what they had stolen from the people. And I'm not only talking about the Marcos clan or the Romualdez clan, but all those instant businessmen who came about because of the Marcos regime. Every single one of them. To the extreme, I sometimes think that the Sandinistas had a perfect solution. You know, they call it the bazooka solution. But we have not managed to get any single human rights violator from the military or the constabulary to be brought to justice. This is a problem. We had enabled them to continue with their violations and the looting and the influencing of government to their own advantage. Next time the wheel turns, let us make sure that full justice is attained. That's all.
Thanks, Ms. Ninotchka, and thanks to everyone for all your insights and sharing with everyone here on the Zoom webinar. I'd like to end and wrap up this whole conversation with a spoken word presentation by Alfonso Manalastas. Take it away.
Ali. And before anything else, once again, I'd like to thank Vista for creating this platform, for gathering people together to commemorate this violent, dark part of history, and to sort of allow us to investigate and interrogate our own memory, our collective memory as a people in relation to the Marcos era. And also, before I start my performance, I would like to sort of call on artists who are watching right now. Artists are, multifaceted people. Our responsibility to our nation does not exist only within our artistic mediums. It does not only exist within the page. It does not only exist within the canvas, within the song sheet and whatnot. Our responsibility always transcends our artistic production, and so it's gonna be a constant call for me for other artists to not just participate in the discourse through creative means, but also organize, also mobilize, also take it to the streets, so to speak. Also express solidarity with peasant movements, for example, with the broader spectrum of human rights defenders that we have in our ranks. And so I'd like to end this talk with a spoken word performance. This piece is something I wrote back in 2016 when a certain someone was buried in a certain plot of land that I do not believe he should have been buried in. And I still do not believe he's a hero. We condemn this person absolutely. And we need to always remind ourselves to nurture our anger in order for us to be able to, no longer commit the same mistakes we've committed in the past. The title of this piece is 10 Easy Steps on How to Be a Filipino Hero. I hope you guys like it. 10 easy steps on how to be a Filipino hero. Step number 1, you must always win. Top all your exams, marry the most beautiful woman from the South. Legends are winners who keep on winning, so by all means win. Your name will ring into a scent, and soon the whole world will become so instinctively attuned to your victory that they will never know of your defeat. 2, raise beautiful children. Instill upon them your ideals. They will keep your name blaring in the sound waves even long after you're gone, your waxed corpse frozen by the cold-bloodedness of your legacy. 3, run for the highest seat in the land. Your iron fist will fit that iron throne like an iron glove, baby. You were born for this. 4, you are a great man with great plans, and as all great things, you are bound to make enemies. Arm yourself with powerful friends. Bend the law to your will. Summon bullets and hand grenades to punish those who defy you the way God summoned flood and thunder to punish the sinner and non-believer. You are God, and this is your temple of worship. Make them kneel. 5, when a boy speaks to your daughter in a language that does not know worship, in a tongue that curls only to question, punish him too. He is no enemy, not of this land, but he holds in his mouth a voice that can make the pillars of your great castle shudder. He must be silenced. He must be stopped. 6, the world will soon hear of your accomplishment, and who cares if you're belligerent, for as long as you're omnipotent, magnificent, you are magic. Let the world watch as you pluck your enemies one by one from the ground and make them all disappear. You are a magician. 30 years and we still couldn't find the trap door. 7, you will fall at the hands of a woman in a yellow dress. Your high holiness will be banished from your kingdom. Use this time to pray that it rots in your absence. 8, die in the most natural way. 9, your children will grow up without you. They don't have to be particularly bright or talented or kind, but they will carry your last name and honesty. What can anyone ever really ask for? They will return in fleets and dragons, ready to reclaim a kingdom that has long forgotten. Relish as they bring an entire nation and its history to its knees, warped, mutated, and repackaged. Your memory will resonate across 100 million people begging to be hurt the way they were hurt in your reign. 10, sit back and relax as they slowly sink your body 6 feet underneath the same graveyard that cradles the fallen. The brave men who once fought you and your kind. History takes full circle, and we saved only the best seat for a hero like you. Thank you.
A very brave and thought-provoking piece to end this very important conversation for us to spend the rest of the day reflecting on. Again, I'd like to thank each of our speakers, Ma'am Iting, Attorney Chel, Ms. Ninotchka, Nicole, and Alfonso, and our reactors, Aura, JB, and Will, for really delving deep in our nation's past and current state, and bringing all of us with you in this conversation. But we hope that we continue to keep this memory alive, everything that we talked about, the important people that we mentioned, the people in our family that we think of when we look back on the martial law era. In pursuit to never forget, dakila and bantayog ng mga bayani with the help of Forum Asia, and through this very festival that we're a part of right now, we present Wall of Remembrance, Digital Bantayog ng mga bayani. It's a joint effort to bridge gaps in martial law education by expanding and extending working spaces for education, and it opens today. It's hosted on martiallaw.ph. It's a virtual space serving as a living memorial to a pivotal period in Philippine history, the Digital Museum of Martial Law in the Philippines. So aside from the Wall of Remembrance that I hope you do get a chance to check out today, if not spend the whole week to take the time to look back. There are also other features on the martiallaw.ph website that you can also explore. And we hope this can also be a good tool for educators that you can share with your students, and students that you can share with your friends and family. If ever, I know it's a recurring question, how do we talk about a topic like this to people that we love? And usually that conversation is a lot harder to do than with strangers that we meet on the internet. This exhibit on the Bantayog ng mga Bayani's iconic Memorial Center is now accessible to digital visitors from here in the Philippines, all regions, and abroad. So it's a stylized and up-to-date and interactive exhibit to get to know our heroes of the martial law era and keep the memories of the lives they sacrificed and their contribution to our nation alive. Visit the page and take the time to honor and remember those who came before us and those whose shoulders we stand on today. If ever going back to the topic of talking about it with your friends and siblings and family members, if you ever need support in how to go about this, because it is a difficult challenge to do, difficult but very necessary, you can join any of our youth orgs that are here today. I'm sure it's a very good community to be a part of, a very good support system, and we can share learnings with one another and learn more about the country and other things that you can share with them. So go ahead and message any one of our attendees here that are representing an org. But I'd also like to plug in our major youth partner, #WeTheFuturePH. So you can log on to bit.ly/WTFPH sign up. We can type that in the chat box then. So I hope you do find your community that can help support you as you take on that challenge of organizing your friends and family. The Vista International Human Rights Film Festival will run from, it started last Saturday, the 19th, and it'll go on until the 27th. So you have this whole week to catch the films, the other forums, the 2 other forums we have, and events all week long. Also, to the attendees who stayed with us here on Zoom, we'll be giving out 100 free passes, randomly selected, to watch The Kingmaker. So watch out for an email on how to claim this soon. And if you're interested in watching more films, so we have 20 films, 20 feature length and 20 short films. Check out our Eventive page, watch.activista.ph/activistaph. Also check it out in the chat box. And you can also avail of discounted tickets at our website, activista.ph. I'd like to invite you all for our next forum, our third of 4 this festival. The topic naman would be on disinformation and deception decoded. This forum is in partnership with the Friedrich Naumann Foundation and FIGHT. Exciting panel waiting for us then also is Ms. Miko Kamba of Vera Files, Mr. John Neri of the Philippine Daily Inquirer, and communication strategist Mr. 𝐃𝐞𝐦𝐿 at iba pa. The forum will also be moderated by Mr. Zach Yuson of FIGHT. For that forum, we'll be giving away free passes to The Cleaners by Hans Block and Moritz Reiswijk. So do register. We'll also link that in the chat box. Ang dami naming nililink. I hope you check every one of those links out. And last announcement from me for today is tonight at 7 p.m. Catch Dissidents. It's our event in partnership with the UP Cinema as Art Movement. It's gonna be moderated by June Sabayton and Erwin Romulo. And they'll be screening the works of Anton Nartia, AJ Cruz, Carlo Lopez, as well as the pioneer members of UPCAM, J. Lucas Reyes, Erwin Romulo, and Darwin Yuson. Catch the Talk Back. It's a very interesting mix of the old and new generation. Also, very interesting, after this event, we'll be screening the films of Sir Cesar Hernando. So do watch out for that. That's tonight starting at 7 p.m. Check it out at the Activista Facebook page. And yun, again, I'm Alice Wico, your host. Thank you for sharing this brief moment in our history with us. And remember that we were together in this space, in this time, to share and learn and collectively stand in solidarity in our demands for justice and accountability, and in the cause of never again and never forget. So everybody, please keep safe, stay healthy, and I'll see you on Friday. So take this time to please feel free to leave the Zoom webinar. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you to our reactors. And that's it. Goodbye. See you soon.
Papatayin ba natin yan? May buhay din yan. Pero ang matigas ng ulo, patayin talaga.
In my country, there's 3 million drug addicts. I'd be happy to slaughter them to finish the problem.